The title of my sermon is The Christian Ethic. And it's drawn from the verse, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Jesus used this rhetorical device 4 times in this morning's gospel reading. He was setting up the way he interpreted the law, the Torah. In the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus, the rabbi, speaking to his disciples, but really through them to the crowd also gathered on the hillside, overlooking the blue of the Sea of Galilee. As he spoke, our messianic rabbi called his listeners to a higher ethic. You may recall from last week's reading that Jesus said, "I have not come to abolish, but fulfill the law." The 4 statements we heard read this morning about anger, adultery, divorce, and oaths illustrated how he wanted to fulfill the law. Jesus intensified the law. He was not asking his followers to adhere to the existing religious rules and certainly not to ignore them. He instead desired them to embody the law, to internalize it, to make it central to their identities, and to infuse the law into their souls. Jesus called those gathered to awaken their souls to the love of God within them. We may wonder how the disciples and the others considered Jesus' words. Did some mouths go dry as they felt convicted by what Jesus said? Did they look askance at a friend knowing the oaths they had broken? Were others angry, feeling Jesus had called them out for an honest mistake? Did they purse their lips at Jesus' ethical challenge? Many likely did. Later in Matthew, the disciples even blurted out the question, "Then who can be saved?" We might surmise that those words hung in their minds as Jesus spoke about gouging eyes and severing limbs. When he spoke about removing body parts, Jesus might have been venting. He had seen the very religious asking others to do what they wouldn't. Jesus had seen the weight of ethical rules burdening those living far from Jerusalem. He had read the prophets of old, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the others, who criticized people for their empty faith, which he witnessed again in his own time. His frustration likely rose because many religious people were missing the point. Their morality was meaningless, and their ethical actions were hollow. Jesus held out a high standard because he was completely and utterly in love with God. Jesus knew that God had created the law to help people better relate to God and their neighbors. The law was not punishment, but a way to live in right relationships. God and Jesus had a relationship overflowing with love. They wanted the same for humans. Jesus came to awaken the love of God within them. Those around Jesus might have struggled to accept his teaching, except for one reason. Jesus was with them. They could see how he cared for the poor. They could see how he healed the sick. They could see him giving sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and making the lame walk. They also witnessed Jesus criticizing the cold-hearted religious leaders who criticized others for a lack of faith. When it comes to religion today, 3 types of people exist. Some people believe that God doesn't exist. They argue that the world came into being on its own, and we are here today by happenstance. They think that life has no other purpose than self-fulfillment. People should seek their own pleasure and satisfaction, and societies should be structured in a way to allow others to do the same. Their ethic is pragmatic and practical. Religious morality is irrelevant, and therefore so is Jesus' teachings. Another group believes that God may exist, but is not involved in what happens today. God started everything, but that's all. God may desire people to live well and treat others fairly, but humanity has left to figure it out. Prophets like Jesus figured out how to live a good life and happened to share that with others. People would do well to follow the precepts of Jesus and other holy people, but in the end, it may not matter. These people believe it is better to do good than evil, and that's the depth of their ethic. The final group of people believes that God exists and is concerned about and involved with what happens today. God started everything and sent prophets to help people live well. When the people didn't listen to the prophets, he sent his son Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount gave his followers ethical guidance about living in a right relationship with God and others. Central to that relationship was and is love. We may struggle with some of Jesus' teaching. Some of what Jesus said is not easy to hear or follow. But we must remember that the Christian ethic starts in our hearts and souls. If we still find Jesus' statements difficult, then we must not forget that Jesus not only walked among us, but he also knew our pain, our shame, and our fears. If not for his suffering at the hands of the Romans and death at Golgotha, we might dismiss Jesus' intensification of the law. We can trust him because the Son of God lived like us. We can believe in God because his Son lived, suffered, and died for us. We can strive to follow the Christian ethic because God is not distant nor removed. God's love lives in our souls. Many people don't recognize it. Some people ignore it. Some can't believe it, yet it is there. The divine light is in us. But it can be snuffed out by evil acts and wanton depravity. Sin can darken souls until they have no light left. But that is not the end. The depraved and the sin-sick only must call out for God's mercy, and divine love returns. And they rediscover the ethic of love. Jesus called his listeners to an ethic that began and emerged from their hearts and souls. The core of Jesus' teaching and life of faith he taught centered on what filled their hearts. Jesus' words this morning call us to that same ethic. He calls us to that high bar. He calls us to act ethically using the love of God that lives and grows in our souls.